In the heart of the nation, where history has been written in both triumph and tragedy, a powerful regime stands on the precipice of collapse. For decades, its leaders wielded authority with unchallenged might, shaping the lives of millions, controlling the flow of wealth, and dictating the course of history itself. Yet, power, no matter how absolute, carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. Behind the gilded halls, whispered betrayals and hidden agendas festered. The world would watch as a once mighty order unraveled, not in a day, nor a year, but in a sequence of events as intricate and devastating as any epic ever told. The story of this regime is inseparable from the story of the nation itself. Born from the aftermath of conflict and uncertainty, it grew by consolidating control over military, political, and economic institutions. Its leaders mastered both the art of governance and the craft of fear. Policies were enacted to stabilize the nation, but stability came at a cost. Opposition was silenced, dissent quietly eliminated. Citizens learned to obey, to adapt, or to disappear from the public record. The regime's leaders were not merely politicians, they were architects of perception. Every public speech, every media broadcast, every monument erected was a calculated message, an assertion of inevitability, a demonstration that power itself had a human form, and that human form was untouchable. Even the most formidable structures bear cracks. By the final decade of the regime, subtle but unmistakable signs of fracture began to appear. Internal factions, once united under a single vision, grew increasingly divided. Advisors whispered of betrayals, ministers questioned loyalties. Corruption, once contained, spread with reckless abandon. Policies that had been enforced with precision now faltered. In distant provinces, unrest simmered. Discontent no longer whispered, it roared quietly in alleys and marketplaces, in factories and schools. The leaders, consumed by their own authority, failed to perceive the full scope of their vulnerability. The mechanisms of control, intelligence networks, military loyalty, propaganda, remained potent, yet they were no longer infallible. History would show that it was not an external enemy that toppled this regime, but the slow erosion of unity from within, combined with the relentless force of events that could not be commanded or controlled. The first unmistakable signs of collapse arrived quietly. Rumors of a failed coup circulated through the capital. Loyal ministers vanished overnight. Communications, once immediate and reliable, faltered. Outside the palace walls, ordinary citizens felt the tremors of a regime losing its grip. Markets wavered. Law enforcement hesitated. Public confidence, a fragile yet essential pillar of power, began to crumble. Within the corridors of authority, panic emerged. Advisors debated, generals hesitated, and the leader, once resolute, once unchallenged, stood isolated. Decisions were delayed. Orders went unheeded. And in the silence of indecision, history began to write itself. It is in these moments, in the quiet before chaos, that the anatomy of a regime's final days becomes apparent. The interplay of fear, ambition, miscalculation, and inevitability. Power, once absolute, breeds both loyalty and resentment. In the final days of the regime, these twin forces collided within the inner circle. Ministers, generals, and advisors who had once worked in unison now acted in quiet opposition. Ambition, previously restrained by shared fear, now dictated every action. Every decision carried weight beyond its immediate consequences. Promotions were demanded, threats were whispered. The regime's leader, who once inspired unwavering devotion, now faced subtle rebellion at every turn. Meetings that had once been orderly became arenas of veiled hostility. Alliances shifted with alarming speed. Ministers who had been allies for decades changed loyalties overnight. Generals considered coups in hushed consultations. Even the most trusted confidants were no longer beyond suspicion. History is rarely written in grand gestures alone. It is often the quiet manipulations, the fleeting glances, the unsent letters, and the whispered conspiracies that define the collapse of empires. In these moments, the regime was unraveling, not with the crash of armies, but in the subtle erosion of trust. While the palace wrestled with internal dissent, the world outside sensed a shift. The people, long conditioned to obedience, began to test the boundaries of control. Markets experienced instability, supplies wavered. Labor strikes and small protests, once swiftly contained, persisted longer, bolder. Media, tightly controlled for decades, could no longer fully conceal the cracks. Underground publications, clandestine radio broadcasts, and whispered rumors became instruments of change. The populace began to understand that authority was fallible, and fallibility breeds courage. The regime's propaganda, once omnipresent and unchallenged, began to falter. Its symbols of strength, the banners, the grand parades, the speeches, felt hollow. For the first time, the people glimpsed a reality where power was not eternal. By this stage, the fissures within the regime had widened beyond repair. Key figures, long loyal to the leader, began to defect publicly. Statements of support were retracted. Secret communications confirmed the inevitable. These defections were more than symbolic, they were contagions of doubt. Each high-profile abandonment emboldened others. Generals, ministers, and civil servants faced a stark choice: remain loyal to a sinking ship or align with the emerging tide of change. History reveals a pattern in moments of collapse. Loyalty is conditional, fear is transient, and perception shapes reality. When those at the top falter, the illusion of power dissipates quickly. What remained of the regime was a shell, carefully maintained by ritual, habit, and memory, but empty at its core. Pressure from outside the palace intensified. Opposition movements, once fragmented and disorganized, coalesced into coordinated action. Urban centers became arenas of confrontation. Communication lines were disrupted. Supply chains faltered. The regime, now besieged both internally and externally, relied on force and fear to maintain control, but these tools were no longer sufficient. Soldiers, hesitant to fire on their own people, wavered. Commands went unanswered. Every failed operation, every miscalculation, amplified the perception of weakness. Power, once absolute, was now fragile, its demise accelerated by the very authority it had relied upon for decades. As the final weeks approached, the regime's grip on power became increasingly tenuous. Decision-making slowed to a crawl. Orders were repeated, misunderstood, and ignored. Even the leader, once decisive and commanding, appeared trapped by indecision. Internal conflicts reached a crescendo. Generals argued over strategy, ministers plotted against each other. Fear and mistrust permeated every council chamber. The palace, once a symbol of unassailable authority, became a theater of paranoia. Outside the walls, the people sensed the shift. Markets, streets, and workplaces buzzed with whispered rumors and cautious anticipation. Citizens tested the boundaries of their newfound boldness. Small victories, invisible to the regime, began to accumulate. History shows that regimes rarely collapse in a single, decisive moment. Collapse is a process, a slow, methodical unraveling of loyalty, perception, and control. In these final weeks, the threads holding power together began to snap one by one. The breaking point arrived quietly, yet with profound consequences. A single event, a defection, a protest, a failed security operation, can tip the balance. In this case, it was not a single incident but a cascade, a series of miscalculations, betrayals, and lost control. Key generals refused to act against civilians. Ministers openly challenged orders. Communications failed, leaving the leader isolated, surrounded by allies who no longer believed in his authority. Power had shifted. What had been a monolithic structure of control became a fragile and chaotic network of competing interests. By the end, it was clear to all, the regime's time was over. The fall, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. The regime's defenses, internal and external, collapsed in rapid succession. Streets once silent were filled with the voices of a liberated populace. Military units switched allegiance, refusing to uphold a crumbling order. The leader, once untouchable, was forced to confront the reality of his own mortality in power. Decisions made over decades, policies, alliances, betrayals, had all led to this moment. The collapse was swift, violent in its psychological impact, yet remarkably devoid of the grandeur that had once defined the regime. The fall of a powerful regime is never a singular spectacle. It is the sum of countless actions, errors, and courage. In these final hours, the nation witnessed the ultimate consequence of unchecked authority, the complete erosion of power, legitimacy, and fear. In the wake of collapse, the nation faced the complex task of reconstruction. Institutions had to be rebuilt, trust restored, and history reconciled with reality. The leaders of the fallen regime were remembered both for their accomplishments and their failings, their legacies forever entwined with the tumult they had caused. For the citizens, the aftermath was a mixture of relief, reflection, and uncertainty. Some mourned the stability that had been lost, others celebrated the freedom that had been regained. History, as always, would record both perspectives. The fall of a powerful regime offers profound lessons. Power is never eternal, loyalty is conditional, and the consequences of governance resonate far beyond the halls of authority. Decades later, the story of the regime's final days remains a cautionary tale. Its legacy is not confined to the mistakes of its leaders, nor the suffering of its people. It exists in the delicate balance between authority and accountability, in the fragile trust between rulers and citizens, in the enduring lesson that no power can withstand the weight of its own corruption and hubris. The world remembers both the triumphs and tragedies, the architects of authority and the agents of resistance. And in the quiet reflection of history, one truth stands clear: power, for all its grandeur, is always temporary. The fall of a regime leaves more than empty halls and abandoned offices. It leaves a vacuum, political, social, and moral, that must be filled. In the aftermath, the nation embarked on a slow and deliberate process of rebuilding. Institutions once monopolized by the regime were reconstructed with new frameworks. Policies were re-evaluated, systems of accountability were introduced. Citizens, long accustomed to obedience, now had a renewed voice in shaping their own future. Yet transformation was neither immediate nor complete. Old loyalties lingered, and factions loyal to the fallen regime attempted to influence the new order. Negotiations, compromises, and even confrontations defined this period. Political reconstruction was messy, fragile, and at times uncertain. History demonstrates that the end of authoritarian rule does not erase its imprint. The structures of governance, the expectations of citizens, and the lessons of past failures shaped the emerging political landscape. In the careful work of rebuilding, the nation learned that resilience is as much about persistence as it is about courage. As decades pass, the story of the regime's final days becomes more than history. It becomes a guide, a warning, a mirror reflecting the nature of power itself. Future generations inherit both the mistakes and the insights of the past. Leadership, history teaches, is a responsibility, not a privilege. Absolute authority, when unchecked, fosters corruption, discontent, and ultimately, collapse. Loyalty is never guaranteed, fear is temporary, and perception shapes reality as profoundly as any law or decree. The lessons of the past extend beyond politics. They touch the moral fiber of society, the ethical responsibilities of citizens, and the enduring truth that freedom is fragile, yet precious. Power must be exercised with wisdom, integrity, and humility, or it will inevitably be challenged and, eventually, undone. History often remembers the regime as a monolith, a single entity wielding overwhelming authority. But power is never abstract. It is composed of human beings, each with desires, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. In the palace, the leader's closest advisors were both protectors and potential betrayers. Some sought to preserve the regime, believing it was indispensable to national stability. Others measured their loyalty against personal gain, waiting for a moment when ambition could outweigh duty. These human stories, of fear, calculation, and moral compromise, reveal the true anatomy of a collapse. A regime does not fall solely from external pressure. It falls because the people who sustain it are themselves fractured, flawed, and ultimately human. Within the palace, secrets shaped events as decisively as armies or laws. Intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and clandestine alliances dictated the pace of power. The regime's downfall was accelerated by knowledge hidden from its leader, by whispers carried in silence, and by the betrayal of those closest to the throne. Every secret, every deception, was a thread in the tapestry of collapse. Some failed by design, others failed by accident. Yet together, they revealed a central truth: authority, however formidable in appearance, is always vulnerable to the unseen forces that it cannot fully control. While palace intrigues determined the fate of the elite, the people carried the weight of the regime's legacy. Ordinary citizens made extraordinary choices. They protested, resisted, and reclaimed spaces long controlled by fear. Small acts of defiance, workers striking, students organizing, journalists speaking truth, became catalysts for larger change. The collapse was not just political, it was moral, a reflection of a society awakening to the limitations of authority. Through the courage of the populace, the regime's myth of invincibility crumbled. History often credits leaders for power, but it is the people who shape destiny when authority falters. The fall of a regime is a mirror for the future. Beyond the immediate chaos, it leaves lessons embedded in architecture, institutions, and culture. Generations that follow inherit both the mistakes and the insights of the past. Globally, parallels emerge. Every regime that overextends, that suppresses dissent, that concentrates power unchecked, leaves a trail for history to judge. The story of these final days is neither unique nor inevitable, it is part of the recurring pattern of human governance. In remembering, in analyzing, in reflecting, societies gain not just historical knowledge, but the wisdom to navigate power with caution. And in that reflection lies the enduring truth: power is transient, authority is conditional, and the future belongs to those who understand both. Power, for all its outward appearance of control, is a psychological force as much as a political one. Behind the facade of authority, leaders are human, prone to doubt, fear, and overconfidence. In the final months, the regime's inner circle was consumed by paranoia. Every gesture, every hesitation, became a signal. Advisors misread intentions. Generals questioned loyalties. And the leader, isolated from truth, made decisions that accelerated the collapse. History demonstrates that the psychology of power is as decisive as armies or policies. When ambition, fear, and ego collide, even the most fortified regimes can unravel. While the palace trembled, resistance was quietly orchestrated outside its walls. It was not always public, nor immediately visible, but it was relentless. Ordinary citizens became strategists. Clerks, teachers, factory workers, and students coordinated, communicated, and defied. Information flowed through hidden channels. Coded messages, secret meetings, and subtle acts of defiance became the invisible engine driving change. The collapse of the regime was not only a political event, it was a human story of resilience. It was a reminder that power depends not only on fear but also on consent, however silent, of the governed. The final days of the regime were not observed only within national borders. The world watched, analyzed, and predicted. Foreign powers calculated influence, seeking advantage while maintaining appearances of neutrality. Diplomats monitored unrest, intelligence agencies gathered data, and international media conveyed both rumor and fact. The regime's collapse was a lesson in geopolitics. No nation exists in isolation, and the fall of authority resonates far beyond the borders where it occurs. This global perspective underscores a critical truth: the ripples of power extend farther than any leader anticipates. What happens behind palace walls echoes on the world stage. After the dust settled, the nation, and the world, faced the task of remembering. Memory is selective. Some recall the terror, others the hope. Some celebrate the collapse as liberation, others mourn what was lost. The regime, once feared and revered, became myth. Statues, portraits, and monuments stand as reminders of both power and fallibility. Stories are passed down, cautionary tales, heroic accounts, and moral reflections. History, in the end, is both record and interpretation. The final days of this powerful regime endure as a testament. Power is fleeting, human ambition is fallible, and the true legacy of governance is measured not by dominance but by wisdom and restraint. While the halls of power trembled, ordinary lives were caught in the grip of uncertainty. Families navigated shortages, children witnessed fear, and communities adapted to survive. The collapse of authority was not only political, it was deeply personal. Parents questioned how to protect their children. Workers struggled to sustain livelihoods. Teachers and doctors continued their duties in environments where law and order had begun to fracture. These human stories remind us that the cost of power's failure is often paid not by the mighty, but by those who live under it. History remembers empires, but the lives they touch are infinitely more complex. The regime's collapse was mirrored in the economy. Production stalled, trade routes faltered, and essential services broke down. What had once been a controlled, prosperous system now became a fragile ecosystem of scarcity and improvisation. Markets, once tightly regulated, became zones of improvisation. Entrepreneurs, both legal and illicit, attempted to fill the gaps left by a government in disarray. Inflation rose, currencies fluctuated, and ordinary citizens bore the brunt of instability. The economic unraveling reinforced the social consequences of political collapse. It was a tangible reminder that the fall of power is not abstract, it is a lived experience. Culture became a refuge and a weapon. Artists, writers, and musicians responded to the regime's final days with subtle defiance. Poems, paintings, songs, and performances captured both fear and hope, turning creativity into resistance. Underground movements thrived in basements, cafes, and quiet corners. Knowledge was preserved in hidden manuscripts. Symbols of identity and memory flourished amidst chaos, proving that even when authority collapses, human expression endures. These acts of culture were more than defiance, they were affirmation. They reminded citizens, and the world, that a nation's soul cannot be destroyed by political decay. Even decades later, the fall of the regime reverberates. Its consequences, political, social, economic, and cultural, echo through generations. Policies enacted under its rule still influence governance. Families remember the hardships. Communities bear the scars. History does not simply record events, it carries forward their lessons. The story of this regime's final days is a testament to human ambition, the fragility of authority, and the enduring power of collective memory. Ultimately, the rise and fall of power is both dramatic and instructive. It is a reminder that governance requires wisdom, vigilance, and humility, and that no force, however absolute, can withstand the inexorable passage of history. The story of this regime is not unique. Across centuries and continents, empires have risen and fallen, repeating patterns of ambition, hubris, and eventual collapse. From Rome to Versailles, from Berlin to Moscow, the architecture of authority mirrors itself: centralized power, rigid hierarchies, and the illusion of invincibility. And yet, the ultimate lesson is always the same: unchecked authority is unsustainable. Comparative history teaches that every regime is vulnerable to the same forces: internal betrayal, public dissent, economic instability, and the relentless passage of time. The final days of this regime were neither an anomaly nor a failure of fate. They were a predictable outcome of human ambition and institutional fragility. Power is more than control, it is moral responsibility. Leadership is not simply about authority or governance, it is about choices, ethics, and the weight of consequences. In the final days, decisions made by the regime's leaders reverberated far beyond the palace walls. Every act of oppression, every ignored warning, every calculated deception had consequences for millions. History does not judge leaders solely by their intentions, it judges by the results of their actions. The collapse serves as both a caution and a reflection. Governance without integrity is fleeting. The true measure of power is not the magnitude of fear it can generate, but the lasting impact it leaves on the society it touches. Among the rubble of authority, lives continued. Survivors of the regime tell stories rarely found in textbooks: tales of courage, ingenuity, and moral endurance. Teachers who protected students, medics who risked lives for the sick, citizens who sheltered the vulnerable. These were the invisible architects of resilience. Their actions, small yet profound, demonstrate that human agency persists even under extreme duress. History remembers rulers, but it is the people who endure, adapt, and rebuild. Their testimony provides the deepest insight into the social cost of power and the resilience of society in the face of collapse. The story of the regime's final days is now part of history, a chronicle of authority, ambition, and consequence. Yet history is not static. It is interpreted, remembered, and passed on to new generations. Lessons from the past guide decisions in the present. They shape governance, ethics, and society itself. Monuments, archives, and oral histories serve as reminders that power is both a privilege and a responsibility. Ultimately, the story is a reflection of human nature: ambition and fallibility, courage and cowardice, oppression and resilience. It is a testament to the impermanence of authority and the enduring spirit of those who live under it. Power is not held by a single individual, it is shared, constructed, and enforced by those around the throne. Ministers, generals, and trusted advisors were the invisible architects of authority, shaping decisions, policies, and the perception of control. Some were loyal to the nation. Others were loyal only to themselves. And in the final days, ambition often outweighed allegiance. Meetings once governed by protocol became arenas of intrigue and subtle sabotage. It is within these human networks that the regime's vulnerabilities multiplied. History reveals that the downfall of empires often begins not in public streets, but in secret offices and whispered conversations. While the capital braced for collapse, the provinces bore their own burdens. Long-standing grievances, ethnic tensions, and economic disparities surfaced with renewed urgency. Local officials, once instruments of central authority, began to act independently. Protests, strikes, and localized uprisings multiplied, demonstrating that the regime's control had never fully penetrated the nation. In some regions, civilians and local leaders organized governance in the absence of central authority. The fractures in provincial governance accelerated the national collapse, revealing that power depends not only on presence at the center but on legitimacy and trust across the entire state. No regime exists in isolation. Intelligence operations, espionage, and secret diplomacy quietly shaped the final days. Allies monitored, adversaries plotted, and secret channels dictated both internal and external strategy. Defections, leaks, and intercepted communications became decisive. Every hidden message carried the potential to accelerate collapse. For decades, secrecy had sustained authority. In the end, it hastened its demise. The shadow world of intelligence illustrates a simple truth: knowledge is power, and in the absence of trust, knowledge becomes the weapon that topples empires. Even as authority crumbled, culture persisted. Artists, writers, and ordinary citizens resisted invisibly, embedding dissent in music, literature, and visual expression. Cultural survival became both refuge and weapon. Graffiti, coded performances, and clandestine publications conveyed defiance. Even when the streets were patrolled by soldiers, creativity endured, a quiet but powerful form of protest. Culture, in its resilience, outlasted fear. It preserved memory, identity, and hope for a nation in turmoil, proving that even in collapse, the human spirit finds expression. The fall of the regime did not occur in a vacuum. Its collapse sent ripples across borders. Allies reconsidered commitments, adversaries recalculated strategy. Regional stability was tested, and the international balance of power shifted subtly, yet decisively. Global media framed the collapse as both cautionary tale and spectacle. Foreign leaders weighed intervention against diplomacy, understanding that the fate of one nation could influence the course of others. History demonstrates that the consequences of a regime's final days extend far beyond its own borders, shaping geopolitics, trade, and diplomacy for decades to come. Finally, the story of a fallen regime is preserved in memory. Generations learn not only the facts but the lessons embedded within them, lessons of ambition, hubris, courage, and resilience. Monuments, archives, and oral histories serve as reminders. Power is temporary, authority is fragile, and the consequences of governance endure beyond the life of a single ruler or administration. Memory is the bridge between past and future. By remembering the rise and fall of authority, societies equip themselves to navigate the challenges of their own time with wisdom, integrity, and vigilance. While history records power struggles and political maneuvers, it is the human cost that is often overlooked. Families endured uncertainty, fear, and loss. Children watched as parents vanished or struggled to survive. Citizens navigated a world where law was uncertain and security fleeting. Even small missteps carried enormous consequences. Jobs were lost, homes abandoned, and communities fractured. The collapse of authority created a vacuum filled not only with uncertainty but with grief, resilience, and the quiet courage of those who persevered. These personal stories, though rarely headline news, illuminate the profound cost of unchecked power. The regime may have fallen, but the echoes of its decisions lingered in every household. The regime's collapse was not solely the result of ambition or betrayal. It was also the culmination of systemic failures, policies that stifled growth, neglected infrastructure, and widened social inequality. Decisions made in the name of stability often exacerbated unrest. Economic mismanagement, suppression of dissent, and concentration of authority in the hands of few created a brittle structure, one that could not withstand internal fracture or external pressure. History reveals a stark truth: the fall of power is as much about governance as it is about betrayal. Even the most disciplined regime cannot endure policies that fail to meet the needs of the people it governs. While the regime crumbled, resistance flourished in ways unseen by the public eye. Networks of ordinary citizens, intellectuals, students, and activists operated in secrecy, preserving knowledge, organizing dissent, and maintaining hope. These networks relied on ingenuity and trust, passing information through coded messages, hidden meetings, and subtle acts of defiance. In the end, their persistence proved decisive. The fall of the regime was not imposed from outside alone, it was enabled by the coordinated courage of those who refused to remain silent. Resistance is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even under extreme oppression, agency and morality persist. The ultimate lesson of the regime's final days lies in governance itself. Leadership is not merely the exercise of authority, it is the stewardship of responsibility. Unchecked power, when divorced from accountability, leads inevitably to collapse. Authority must be tempered by morality, tempered by foresight, and informed by the well-being of those it serves. History endures as both record and teacher. The rise and fall of this regime demonstrates that power is fragile, that ambition must be guided by ethics, and that the consequences of governance reverberate across generations. The story of power, ambition, and collapse is endless, but the lessons it leaves behind endure forever. In understanding the past, humanity learns to navigate the future with greater wisdom. As the regime teetered, the leader found isolation inevitable. Allies became observers, advisors became cautious, and even trusted confidants spoke only in careful whispers. Isolation amplifies fear. Decisions once clear became paralyzed by doubt. Every choice carried the weight of potential betrayal. The corridors of power, once vibrant with activity, echoed only with uncertainty. History shows that isolation is one of the most potent catalysts for a regime's collapse. Even authority at its zenith is powerless if its holder cannot trust those around them. In the palace, betrayal often takes subtle forms. Plans were made in shadowed rooms. Agreements were broken in silence. Loyalty was conditional, fragile, and transactional. Some advisors sought personal gain. Generals waited for opportunity. Civil servants recorded events to shield themselves from accountability. Each act of betrayal was small, almost invisible, yet collectively they dismantled the regime from within. Collapse is rarely sudden. It is built on layers of quiet treachery, where ambition and fear intersect in ways that become irreversible. While power struggled in the halls of the elite, ordinary citizens bore the brunt of instability. Scarcity, fear, and uncertainty became daily companions. Communities adapted creatively, sharing resources, organizing local security, and maintaining schools and markets where the government had failed. Their resilience, unrecorded in official history, ensured survival. The people became the silent backbone of society, quietly upholding civilization while authority disintegrated around them. As defection spread and dissent escalated, institutions once thought permanent crumbled. Ministries ceased to function. Military units ignored orders. Bureaucracies, the scaffolding of power, became relics of a system no longer sustainable. Every failure reinforced the perception of weakness. Once vital organizations transformed into hollow shells, their authority eroded not by armies but by human choice, the unwillingness to obey a failing system. History teaches that when institutions fail, authority cannot endure. Collapse is systemic, and it begins with the erosion of trust. Society does not only feel the collapse of authority politically, it feels it culturally. The final days of the regime inspired art, literature, and music that reflected fear, hope, and moral questioning. Cultural expression became a record of lived experience. Murals depicted resilience. Literature captured tragedy and courage. Music carried subversive messages, encoding dissent and memory for future generations. Even as power fell, culture endured, preserving collective identity, ethical reflection, and the spirit of resistance. Over time, the regime's story became legend, myth, and historical record. Memory shaped perception. Some remembered tyranny, others heroism. Some celebrated liberation, others mourned the stability that was lost. History is interpretive. The final days of this regime provide lessons not only about power, but about morality, resilience, and the human capacity to survive, adapt, and bear witness. In the end, the story is both cautionary and illuminating. Memory is the bridge between past and future, ensuring that the consequences of authority, its triumphs and its failures, are never forgotten. As the regime faltered, eyes from across the world turned toward the nation. Foreign governments weighed alliances, reassessed trade agreements, and debated intervention. Journalists reported every shift, every rumor, broadcasting both hope and fear to a global audience. Diplomats carefully maneuvered, balancing the appearance of neutrality with strategic positioning. Intelligence agencies monitored communications, anticipating the inevitable collapse, and preparing contingency plans. History demonstrates that no regime exists in isolation. The fall of power sends ripples across borders, influencing policy, diplomacy, and perception in distant capitals. What happens in one nation can alter the trajectory of many. Behind the public chaos, the hidden world of espionage was decisive. Spies, double agents, and informants shaped the outcome as much as street protests or political defections. Intelligence flows determined who would act, when, and how. The regime's final decisions were guided by incomplete information, misinformation, and betrayal. Allies became enemies, enemies became sources of vital insight. In the end, the collapse of authority was as much a product of information, its flow, distortion, and concealment, as it was of armies or laws. Power, fragile in reality, is always vulnerable to knowledge. Beyond generals, ministers, and foreign powers, the human stories of survival reveal the deepest truths. Diaries and personal accounts record the ordinary experience of fear, hope, and perseverance. A teacher hiding students in basements. A medic risking life to treat the wounded. A journalist documenting truth under threat of arrest. These lives, rarely celebrated in history books, offer the closest view of society in the final days. Their accounts are not just testimony, they are enduring evidence that human resilience persists, even under the weight of collapsing authority. The story of this regime is now complete, yet its lessons remain timeless. Power is transient. Authority, no matter how absolute, is fragile. Ambition and hubris can build empires, but also bring them to ruin. Societies endure not only through leaders, but through the courage, resilience, and morality of their people. Culture, education, and memory preserve identity and guide the future. History remembers both the rise and the fall. It remembers not only the architects of power but the voices, struggles, and perseverance of those who lived through it. In the end, the grand lesson is clear: to wield authority wisely, to act with integrity, and to preserve the humanity of governance, for the consequences of failure are never confined to the corridors of power, they are borne by generations to come.